Thanks everybody for joining us and coming back. I know it's late on the second day. That's a hard window, but we appreciate everybody being here. We're going to talk a lot about policy and compliance challenges today. Try to keep that focused obviously on the operational impacts for the mainframe platform, but we'll broaden out a little bit as well, and I neglected to get the clicker, so I am going to grab that. So my name is Brendan Peter. I lead CA's Global Government Relations team based out of Washington, D.C. And as you might expect, CA, like any large global company, is significantly impacted by regulations, just as you are. The reality is that when policy changes in a market, that changes market behavior. And so as a company, CA is engaged in a range of policy debates around the world that impact our business and impact our customers' business. We're going to talk a little bit today in particular around the most active topic everywhere in the world, which is cybersecurity and data privacy. So we've got a great panel of experts that are going to be here participating with us, and I'll just do a very, very brief introduction, and I'm going to do a couple of slides just to set the scene about what we're seeing globally, and then we'll jump into a discussion about some of the big implementation issues that a lot of these policy changes make. So to my immediate left is Stuart McIrvine, Vice President in our mainframe business unit here at CA Technologies. Stuart's team owns all of CA's mainframe security products, and before he came to CA, Stuart was at both HP and IBM, and is based in North Carolina. So thanks for joining us.
Yep, thanks.
To Stuart's left is Chad Rickensrud from, and I got that right, didn't I?
Close enough.
All right, darn it, sorry. I thought I had it. Chad is from RSM Partners. He is the Director of North American Operations and is focused specifically on security issues in particular. And then immediately to Chad's left is Joe Steronis, who is the CTO of PKware, based in Milwaukee. PKware, for those of you that know them or have ever opened a zip file on the web and downloaded, is the inventor of the ubiquitous PK Unzip tool, which I think most of us have used probably 100 times a day. But PKware has really transitioned to more of a security company in the last several years, and so Joe's an expert in security and encryption, and we're hoping to engage him particularly on that topic here today.
We still get a nickel for every zip file that's
Oh, do you?
So,
excellent.
yeah.
Well, then I've given you about $400 in the last 3 minutes, I think.
Keep zipping.
So I didn't go here. Those are us up on the screen, but what I wanted to do is just spend a few minutes and give you a little bit of context, obviously, about what we're seeing globally in the cyber and privacy landscape. As I mentioned, there's no government in the world that is not focused on systemic cyber risk and data protection. Lawmakers read the newspaper every day. They see high-profile breaches. They see how it impacts citizens. And we're seeing a move in virtually every country around the world to update and augment their existing policy infrastructures for how to deal with cyber threats, how to manage personal information, and how to secure data to make sure that if it's breached, individuals can have access to and correct that data in the hopes of limiting the damages that are caused by data that's being exposed. So there's a range of issues that are being debated around the world. Obviously, a huge focus for policymakers globally is on security and data privacy, particularly in critical infrastructure sectors. So regulated industries that pose the greatest risk to national security or cybersecurity are really under the spotlight. But independent of that, there's a range of other policy issues that are focused on cyber and data privacy that are changing expectations of business and changing requirements that all of us that operate in the international data industry have to deal with as we're looking at how to comply. So I want to just highlight a couple of things that are happening around the world. Obviously, we won't dwell on these a lot. We'd be happy to chat with you more specifically about different initiatives in different countries around the world. We're going to spend some significant time today, obviously, focusing on the EU's General Data Protection Regulation, which, as I'm sure all of you know, comes into force in May of next year. That's the regulation that has taken most of the headlines when it comes to cyber and data privacy. But around the world, there are huge developments in both of these arenas. In the United States, we're seeing a real emerging focus on IoT device security. labeling standards, certification standards around development and software certifications. In the EU, apart from GDPR, same time that GDPR was implemented, we saw a new Network and Information Security Directive that was passed and put into law that requires all of the EU member states to update cyber breach disclosure policies and requirements. That's going to have a cascading impact across the European market as well. In APJ, we have huge developments, both as it relates to local encryption standards, technology controls, cyber mandates, data localization requirements, all of which are seeking to manage different degrees of risk in very different postures. And in Latin America, Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, range of developments in the cyber domain as well that are creating new obligations on businesses to stand behind the security of their operational platforms, warrant different protections for their customers, and also then be able to provide better disclosure and certainty to citizens. At the same time, obviously, the global data protection landscape is one that's evolving very, very rapidly. What I tried to put together on this slide is just to give you a little bit of sense of the maturity and severity of data protection regulations around the world. You'll see quite a range here, obviously, and while many folks in the press and in our industry focus pretty extensively on European privacy law, which is further ahead and much more strict than other international statutes, the reality is that governments around the world are imposing a wide range of data protection standards on industries. Some are sectoral based, some are broadly based across all sectors. A number of governments have constitutional provisions that protect citizen data and give them access to that data. And so the stakes for managing and attesting to the security and privacy of data that you manage are raising every single day. I won't dwell on this slide either. It just gives you some examples again of some different statutes and policies that are moving forward in some different directions. But what I want to do here is, given our focus on the mainframe and given how prevalent data is on that platform, we want to have a conversation with everybody about what the evolving compliance landscape means for the mainframe as a platform, standards and best practices that we're seeing in the market, as well as other evolving trends. And so to kick things off, Stuart, I'd like to maybe ask you, just as a beginning, to talk about what you've been seeing in terms of the compliance landscape over the last several years, how things have been evolving, and what you're seeing as you're talking to customers and their expectations about where this field is moving in terms of compliance and data privacy in the future.
Yeah, very good. So when you say kind of over the last several years, since this is a mainframe context here, I'm going to make the several years 50 plus years, right? Because we've got to think about this. This platform's been around a long time, and the regulations 50 years ago were pretty insignificant. And because of that, we collected enormous amounts of personal information, right, of our clients, our customers, citizens, et cetera, for very good reasons, for customer relationship management and everything else, right? Now, as time goes on, especially as we start to get into the late 80s and early 90s, we saw the birth of many regulations, as Brandon was saying there, that some of them are industry specific, some of them are statewide, geographic wide, et cetera. But really it was kind of the late 80s, 90s when they started to come to fruition. And I look at areas like HIPAA for the healthcare industry, Gramm-Leach-Bliley, PCI, for example. And then on an international basis, look at other regulations, like, if you remember, the safe harbor, right? Now, so you were talking about how it's changing. So that's one aspect of the change, was the level of regulation started to increase. I'd say the next wave of change that really occurred was, as these regulations kind of matured, what really constitutes PII? In the old days, it used to be, name, address, etc. But as we get more into this whole digital era, right, what constitutes PII start to become very different. Now we're looking at IP addresses, right, email addresses, etc., right, bringing in the whole digital aspect, because it's very easy to identify us uniquely by many digital attributes. So that was another significant change, and that's what drove one of the big changes, I would say, in safe harbor, right, is Safe Harbor just didn't really cover. And for those of you that are not aware, Safe Harbor is really kind of the exchange, the regulation of exchanging information between Europe and the US. So it got replaced by Privacy Shield, and the main reason for that was to start to bring in a lot of these digital identifiers, let's say. And that was another thing that drove GDPR, right? But the other aspect, and GDPR, although we might see GDPR as a horribly painful thing, right, it's actually trying to do some good here, right? It's trying to make things easier, so rather than for every European member country having their own individual laws and directives, etc., right, it's really kind of standardizing. So for companies that are across multiple jurisdictions, it makes it significantly easier. But it is much more detailed, so we're certainly seeing it become much, much more granular. So what do I see really kind of moving forward? I would say some of the big changes, these regulations are going to have much more teeth. All the other ones, excluding GDPR, have had pretty minuscule fines, right? You know, nobody really pays attention when there's not really much of a financial penalty. So I see the financial penalties getting much more stringent as we move forward, and a lot of the other regulations kind of getting revamped for, you know, the type of data that we're dealing with now that you know, uniquely identifies us. Yep.
You know, something you mentioned, Stuart, that I hadn't really thought of, and you talk about the duration of the platform actually has a pretty big impact on this, and that is, it could actually be harder. I mean, if we had a crystal ball, we probably wouldn't have used sensitive fields as keys in databases, right. Yet we do, and now that's a huge problem now for GDPR, because what are you going to do when you've got social security number, some other sensitive field that's actually the key field now? You want to encrypt that, well, that's going to screw up all your referential integrity and the rest of the stuff. So, I mean, to a certain degree, actually, I think mainframe actually has a much harder time of trying to achieve some of this, the regulation and compliance.
Yeah. Yep. Were you going to say something, Chad? Sorry. Oh, part of the challenge too, though, I think, Stuart, and you know, I pose this to you and everybody, is there's clearly no universal standard, and so talk a little bit about how organizations are managing compliance with a real patchwork of regulations. You mentioned in your opening talk, obviously, definitions of what is PII are not standardized across the world. Sectoral data based on harm and risk has very different implications in different applications. How are you seeing that customers are managing that? Because you know, the funnel's getting wider every day, and it'd be wonderful if there was, and I'm not advocating for GDPR to be the global standard, let me be clear, because it is significantly complex, but absent harmonization, how are organizations managing that, given that there are literally hundreds of different obligations that they have on the same data sets, given the jurisdiction in which they're operating?
Yeah, I mean, how are they managing it? First of all, I'm going to state that I have the deepest sympathy right now because of exactly what you say, right? It's extremely complex to manage, and a lot of it comes down to defining PII, right? Truly, what is PII? And so, you know, companies internally are coming up with their own definitions. They're looking at various regulations. They're also trying to prepare you know, for the future. What else do we have to deal with? But at the same time, and I think this is an important point, is rather than just having to comply, how do I get business benefit out of what I'm trying to do here, right? So, you know, as I put management and processes around these, am I doing it, I don't need to basically be doing it just for compliance, but do I get additional customer relationship management benefits out of this? So you tend to see that the records that they're pulling together have got to be constructed in such a way that they have a business benefit as well as maintaining compliance, right? But you see a lot of individual companies having their own definitions of PII, and to be fair to them, why should they follow a particular standard for PII when there really isn't one?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Okay. So Chad, you know, obviously a lot of folks they conflate security and privacy. They're very different, but when we think about security, if an organization has implemented robust security, what does that mean when it comes to compliance?
Yeah, I think I think one of the answers to what the question you just asked, Stuart, is where we may end up, and what I see organizations doing is shooting for a benchmark of really good security, for lack of a better superlative, right? And I think if you do security right and you do privacy right outside of regulations, that you will by default meet regulations. And what we end up seeing, though, is a lot more people chasing the regulation. And then, like you said, there's so many different ones. You chase this regulations. They don't often necessarily like contradict one of each other, but what we see is if you just march to the regulation, you may not get security because the next thing that hasn't happened yet will come down the line, and then you'll have to go for that. So I think, I think the answer, or one of the answers, will be more of a looking for standards about how best to secure your system with taking the regulations into consideration, but the goal is to maybe set the bar even higher than that so that the regulations don't have to come along. I mean, one of the things I hear quite a bit when we talk about the idea of data breaches or ransomware or whatever is, you know, on the mainframe, we haven't really had like that big one yet, right? We haven't had that big breach or ransomware or something like that was clearly a mainframe-based attack or mainframe exploited attack. When that happens, we'll probably see a rash of knee-jerk reaction kind of regulation come out of that when they realize that, oh, well, actually, a lot of really important businesses actually use this platform, and they're probably all in the same boat. You know, we've been saying that for a long time, right? When that happens, we'll see that, and we tell customers and say, you know, we want to get ahead of that. We want to be able to set the standard. We want to be able to kind of have the idea of how we do security before it gets regulated, because often then we have to chase that, and it may or may not be what we need from a true security and privacy standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Well, I can tell you from all of my conversations with policymakers around the world that they do not appreciate or understand how much data sits or is resident on the mainframe platform. If you talk to most members of Congress, members of Parliament, they think the platform died 30 years ago. And so they think about everything in the context of apps. They think about relational databases. They don't understand that in modern architectures, when you're building applications and you're pulling data from the mainframe, that's where the data resides. And so it's an issue that we see all over the world just because of an incapability of understanding how the platform works. And so that leads me to a question, Joe, that I'd ask to you is kind of where does the mainframe fit into this compliance landscape? What are the challenges and how is the role of it as a platform given the ubiquity of this regulatory posture evolving?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, maybe to pull on a thread from Stuart, and in terms of the length of time that the platform's been around and the legacy applications that have been there, and actually to pull from what Chad was saying as well, around we've got to set a higher bar. I mean, maybe compliance. I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but maybe compliance is not necessarily the highest bar, I think is what you're saying.
Right.
And I think of this from the standpoint of I don't know that there's any difference between how we actually protect for the mainframe versus how we do others. It's just that there's other challenges, I think, with the mainframe. But the way I look at it is, you've got to protect from thieves, snoops, and idiots. Right? Thieves are the people that are trying to come in all the time. Snoops are the people with unfettered access to your information that potentially could become a thief. But the snoops are the ones that actually are there that, there's not least privilege, something like that. And the idiots are just users that are actually trying to get stuff done. I mean, how many times have you actually been in a crunch where you're trying to get something done and it's like, the fastest way for me to do this is for me to copy this production data over to test or to dev and let me test it over there. That's probably the most unsecure system there is. Unless everybody else is completely different from most people that the dev and test systems have very lax security, and now you just put all that production data on that dev or test system. But again, it's to try to get something done. But we just can't do that anymore.
I think there's one other, in addition to your thieves, snoops, and idiots. I think we have to look at, given the nature of the platform, the nature of the businesses, the economies, the countries that rely on the platform, and the ironic ignorance, to your point, of the fact that it exists and it's as systemically as important as it is, you have to add the adversary in there that isn't a thief, but they're the ideologue, or they're the the ones that just would maybe like to throw a hand grenade in the whole mix and just like watch it go down. And the mainframe is kind of unique in that it's a very small platform. There's a tremendous in terms of numbers of installations.
Right.
Comparatively, the risk, the concentration risk is huge, right? And to some degree, it's been a victim of its own success. Mm-hmm. It runs really well. You forget about it. It just does what it does. There's lots of other things out there screaming for your attention and dollars and that sort of stuff. So it gets neglected along the way. And it just, if you start pinning all these threads together, you've just created this cauldron of like, bubbling crazy, just waiting, for the next thing to happen. And so I add to that somebody else who might be thinking about that, just waiting for the right time to jump.
But I think oh, sorry, I didn't mean to jump in.
Go ahead.
But it just kind of feels like there's I think your comment about we get complacent and it just does what it does. I think we've got to take a really hard look at how we're actually doing. I just was talking to a CISO the other day that they were talking about a system they implemented. They actually opened up a majority of their system to NFS mounts just to be able to scan information. That's. I mean, are you serious? Like, do you realize what you just did? And I don't know that everyone is. I think we've got to take a close look at how we're securing our mainframes these days.
Agreed.
Yeah, and I'm just going to add
go ahead,
one tiny little point which kind of leads off of what both of you have said is, if you look at the typical Chief Information Security Officer in a company now, that individual is very much coming from a distributed background, right? And because of that, the mainframe is becoming less and less understood. And just to your point, there's a dangerous level of complacency, right? And a lot of people, when you don't understand something, you don't tend to deal with it. And there's assumption. Obviously, we've got extremely good mainframe teams, and the CISO saying, I'm just going to leave that up to the mainframe team. They've got it managed, they've got it covered, etc. I'm going to say this, I'm underfunding them as usual, right? Please fund the mainframe teams more. But but I honestly look at the CISO as very much someone who really doesn't understand this platform, and that complacency can be somewhat risky. Yeah,
so I wanted to kick off something. I mean, Joe, you mentioned, and I think that we need to acknowledge this. Obviously, no one has a monolithic infrastructure, and so compliance has to be thought of holistically. But Chad, I wondered if you could talk a little bit about what the specific challenges are with managing compliance on the mainframe as we think about this overall landscape.
Yeah, I think if I gave you a one-word answer, it would be skills. We are at a tremendous deficit of people who have both deep technical knowledge on the mainframe and a really good understanding of the current cyber threat landscape and how adversaries work. What are our real risks? I'll just give you an example. We may talk about pervasive encryption later. There's been a tons of talk about pervasive encryption. But the number of people I talk about pervasive encryption who really understand the specific risk that pervasive encryption protects you from, one, that are deep in the mainframe space, are small. It's a small number of people that really get sort of what is that risk, right? The risk of data exfiltration or whatever. But two, you've companies sort of chasing that, saying, well, that's it, that's what we need. But they still have really horrible password policies, right? They still have 8-character passwords, and they're not using multi-factor authentication. And it's like, guess what, guys? You can go through a year-long implementation of pervasive encryption and all the certificates and lock everything down. But if I can still pretty easily, get your administrator, your crypto administrator, your system programmer, your security administrator's password, all that was for naught. Right? So we have a lot of low-hanging fruit that has to happen. And so I think, you know, to get to the place where you do compliance well on a platform, you have to not only understand what's expected and what's required and what's the bar we're shooting for. We have lots of people that do that, but you have to have people that have deep understandings of the platform, its roots, where it's come from, what are the sort of major Achilles heels in the platform right now, and they just aren't out there. And the ones that are out there tend to end up in organizations far enough down where they can't get the message up to the top of the house that, hey, even though you're not seeing this in the newspaper today, it's still really important. And you know, if we do see it in the newspaper, it's going to be too late. And so I'd say, you know, skills and all the things along with that are the hardest problem we have to solve in the short term in order to ensure not only the security of the platform, but frankly the longevity of it.
Well, luckily the security space in terms of employees is in a negative unemployment right now.
Right. Absolutely.
So that problem probably won't get fixed anytime soon.
Right.
Yeah. And you know, something else I'd like to add to what you're saying. So when we think about compliance on the mainframe, and I look at, you know, all the customers I deal with and the legacy of skills on the mainframe. When you look at security skills, and obviously security is providing a lot of the controls for compliance, right here. When you look at the security skills, the skills are generally around, let's say, identity management, resource access. That's the type of skills we're looking at. When we're talking about compliance here, compliance is certainly around that. You know, are you compliant from your access control perspective, your authentication, all these good areas? That's critical and is monitored, you know, on a very granular basis. But we're talking about data here. That's where most of the regulations are focused. And when you start to look at a data-centric security model, there are less skills on the platform in that area as you start to look at, you know, going beyond, you know, identity and access management, you know, looking at, you know, data scanning and data classification. You know, certainly there are plenty of mainframe skills around the encryption, etc. Right? But and again, I kind of look off platform again. A lot of the customers I talk to, the individuals that are focused and accountable for some of the data-centric security models are on the distributed platform, right? And they tend, you know, yep, mainframe's your responsibility too. Yeah, it's my responsibility, but I've got a whole mess to deal with on distributed platforms here. So I think that's another issue. Yeah. For compliance.
Well, no, and that's a perfect dovetail, I think, and Joe, maybe you can address this, is to talk a little bit about how organizations are orchestrating those compliance efforts across mainframe, distributed, and cloud platforms. As I mentioned, no one has a monolithic infrastructure, and compliance has to be effectuated across that infrastructure. What are you seeing that organizations are doing? How are they handling it? And are there any best practices that you can offer to folks that are here?
So I totally agree with what Stuart was saying about the sort of the disparity. And I mean, how many people here? There's the security group, and then there's the mainframe security group. I mean, there's this split, right? And I don't understand why, because the policies that have to be enforced, whenever I look at the NIST cybersecurity framework, and if you look at NIST cybersecurity framework, it talks about identify, protect, detect, respond, recover, right? So identify, protect are basically pre-event, and detect, respond, recover are post-event. So you've already had the breach, and you're running to go find whatever you need to do. If you look within on the distributed side, if you look on the mainframe side, where is your spend in resources and tools? Are you spending more on detect, respond, recover post-event? Because guess what? That's sexy. I just caught a bad guy, see me, and you know, I get to find out who it is and everything else. That's exciting. Identify, protect, not so exciting. You're identifying sensitive data and you're encrypting it, and then somebody came in and they couldn't find anything and they left. Nobody knows, right? It's like the motto of IT. I mean, the best you can hope for is to be completely ignored. But I think I think you've got to look at that. And the other thing too, and to your point about skills, right? Your resources and people. Identify, protect is more technology oriented. The more technology you can put at this and not people, detect, respond, recover, that's all people for the most part. I mean, there's some technology there, but that's a lot of skills resources that's going to be a drain there. So I think just from distributed as well as mainframe side, focus on, make sure you've got a balance. You've got to have everything, but focus on the pre-event stuff, because I don't think we're spending that much time on it.
Okay, yeah. Stuart, so I do want to turn back, a little bit, because it's this bright, shiny object that we're all focused on now in May of next year. Talk a little bit more about GDPR and what you're seeing out there in the market with how organizations are proceeding, how they're moving along the timelines to get to May, and what you've been experiencing with customers that you've been dealing with as they've been gone to map their compliance journey.
Yep. So I think the first thing I'll say, and I don't think I'm going to surprise anyone in this audience, is nobody's ready. Yep. Nobody's ready at all. People are still trying to understand the scope of the regulation itself. Am I covered in the regulation? What are the differences?
The answer to that is yes, almost universally. So
right, right. And that's a very good point that you bring up, because am I covered? Any large corporation that has customers, or they do selling in any of the European Union, they're covered by it. The other thing that you have to remember about GDPR is GDPR defines controllers and processors, right? And this is important because, sometimes you may outsource something, right? You could outsource your HR, you could outsource payroll, for example. So now you get sensitive information that's under the under the control of a processor. You're the controller because ultimately you own and direct, how this information gets handled, right? But as you start to see the different layers and how they start to span globally, there's a very, very good chance that you're under this regulation, right? The other thing I want to highlight is it is very different. Even though it's trying to standardize a regulation across multiple European Union member countries, right? They've increased the scope of, one, what PII actually is, but, and more importantly, what organizations are required to do with that information, okay? So one of the things, I don't know if you're aware, but once a European citizen hands over their data, they have a right to view that. So they can call you up anytime and say, show me the information you have on that. So you better know what it is and be able to produce it. They have a right to portability, right? You must be able to, so if you're one bank and a customer's decided, I'm going to move to another bank, you're required to find all their information, move that, and delete it if they require you. They have a right to be forgotten, right? Again, when they call up and say, I no longer want you to have my information, right? By law, you're required to delete all of their information, right? And even if you've brought it into accounting and you've shared that information with marketing for customer relationship management and everything else, right? You have to know and keep track of where that is, right? Because you have to delete every instance of that information when you're required to do so, right? So there's a lot to GDPR. I mean, I'm just kind of barely touching the surface of it there. But probably one of the most significant aspects of it, there are bigger fines than any regulation I've ever seen, right? You've probably seen it before, but the fines are, 20 million euros or 4% of your gross annual turnover, right?
Global turnover.
Global turnover, sorry. And, I'm glad you said that, yeah.
You get to 20 million really quickly.
Yeah, exactly. And the point is, between these two numbers, the gross global turnover and the 20 million, it's whichever is greater.
Yeah.
Okay, so these are some of the key aspects. So it's a very different regulation, much more extensive.
Yeah, and I think certainly, I mean, you alluded to this, it's true. I mean, I think virtually every survey out there indicates that a huge percentage of organizations are not ready. And I think there's, a bit of a recalcitrance that, when May comes, the fines aren't going to come quickly. Data protection authorities and individual member states aren't going to be focusing on us. They'll be focusing on bigger fish. And I think to think in that mindset is really at your peril, because one of the new mechanisms under the GDPR as well, which is the basis for how DPAs are going to bring their enforcement actions, is aligned with everything that Stuart said. Given the individual's new rights under the GDPR, if they believe you're running afoul of the provisions, they can make a complaint to your local DPA in a member state where that person lives, which can begin an enforcement or investigation action right away. And so I think 2 years really isn't a long period of time when you think about the complexity of implementing something as foundationally different in terms of data management inside of a large enterprise. And so our organization's going to achieve 100% compliance on day one? No, and I don't think probably anybody expects that that's to happen. But you have to think of the long game here and be very disciplined and regimented about how you're migrating and tackling your various compliance requirements under the statute as a whole. One of the things I did want to also just transition to and chat a little bit as well, Chad, you mentioned this relative to encryption, and obviously I think everybody in the room's seen the IBM Z14 announcement. What does the role of pervasive encryption mean in this context when we're talking about compliance?
But did they announce something?
Yeah.
I must have missed this. That's
Did it? Yeah, no, it
didn't fill my TV and social media.
Anywhere.
It's under non-disclosure.
Yes, every billboard and every ad I've ever seen for the last 6 months. I think that, I'll start out by saying that the part of pervasive encryption that is, so pervasive encryption is a marketing name, but really it boils down to, doing encryption on the wire, doing encryption at rest, and intra-data set encryption. And the data set encryption part of it is actually some real magic, and it is very much what we've been waiting for in terms of data encryption. Because the hard part is anybody here knows, if you went to an application and said, look, your data needs to be stored encrypted, you get this like, oh. Because what does that mean? That means they're going to probably have to rewrite parts of their application. The encryption has to happen at the application level in order to be able to protect it from your system administrator or your storage administrator, right? Those people that by default have access on their system that need to be able to do their jobs are going to be able to read that data. And they're the people, part of the people that we want to be able to protect against. We also want to be able to protect against someone who gets unauthorized access to your system. So what data set encryption does is basically done correctly, and with all the caveats implied, and there are some, it's not just a switch that can be turned on like maybe you've heard, but done correctly, it actually limits the number of people that can read, write, or modify that data down to only those who need it. It truly does. So your storage administrators can still back up the data, restore the data. Your security administrators, all those people that might have access to the underlying mechanism still can't read the data. As long as you do the key management correctly, as long as you do the implementation correctly, it really is useful from this perspective of keeping your data outside from not only external people that might get in, but the internal people that have no need for it. So shameless plug, I'm doing a little bit more deep dive into pervasive encryption right after this on the Tech Talk stage, but it is worth looking into. If you haven't looked into it, look into it. But I'll add on that just as an asterisk, if there is other low-hanging fruit. So it's important, it's complex, you should do it, but there are things that make more sense to do first if you haven't done them already. Yep. But it's going to make some of this easier. The right to be forgotten, for instance, could just be changing a key. Right. I don't have to find that data everywhere now if we had it set up so that these customer records were all encrypted with a customer key, for example. If you change that key, the right to be forgotten becomes much easier. So right. I think it can really help out in the next iteration and the next iteration after that. Yeah,
and I think certainly from our perspective in the policy world, one of the things we're seeing and are anticipating much more stringent requirements around encryption, both at rest and in transit. The challenge as a lawmaker is you want to try to solve a problem, you don't really understand the technology, and so generally they write regulations that are fairly blunt instruments. But I think one of the things that they understand a bit better is that if the data is encrypted at every point in the data life cycle, there's a lot less risk of, if that data is exposed, of it causing more harm. And so I think over time, we're going to see a lot more specific focus on mandates for ubiquitous encryption over time. Sorry, go ahead, Chad.
Yeah, that's all right. You know, the flip side to this is the iPhone debate, right? So iPhone is a particularly well encrypted enclave of a device. So the flip side of this becomes the law enforcement debate. When we start encrypting all the data in a way that only, ideally, the people who need to see the data are the customers and the people who own it, and that's not entirely implausible that it's, you know, Stuart's password and PIN that unwrap the key that allow his data to be decrypted. And if he's now somebody under investigation for X, Y, and Z, he doesn't want to give that up. And we as the bank have implemented this encryption standard very well. Now we've just made law enforcement's job much harder. It's the iPhone debate, but in a much larger scale. So data discovery and stuff like that becomes trickier when it's you know, government mandated.
I do think that's a little different though, because that's a device as opposed to the data itself.
Sure.
Because I think the more we push encryption out to the application, the less it's about the device, and it's not can the FBI get in an iPhone anymore?
Yeah.
So I'm going to go ahead. Sorry, Stuart. Go ahead.
One more little point, and it's really kind of keying off what you were saying, Chad and Brandon, it's the whole breach area, the breach notification, because that's a big part of GDPR and many other regulations. But if you have the data fully encrypted, right, and you lose it, there is no requirement in GDPR or most of the other privacy regulations I know to provide notification.
Yeah, you don't have an obligation.
Okay, you're not obligated. So.
So we've got a couple minutes left, and I want to key off something, obviously, Chad, that you said at the latter part of your previous answer to the question about encryption, and that's low-hanging fruit, right? I mean, it's easy when you take a look at something as complex or as all-encompassing as GDPR or a broader privacy compliance statute, but what are some recommendations you all would offer to the folks in the room about some of that low-hanging fruit, the easy places to start to jumpstart an organization's compliance efforts to get their arms around where they are when it comes to data management and privacy and responsibility? So Stuart or anyone.
Sure, yeah.
I'll start with you and then maybe just go down the line.
Sure, yeah. You know, and I certainly don't want to outline a 12-step program, right? Because, you know, I'm a simple guy and I like kind of simple answers. So I think the key when we think about areas like, you know, with GDPR, you know, the whole right to view, right to portability, right to be forgotten, what does that come down to? It comes down to knowing where this information is, right? You can't delete it or let someone see it until you know where it is. So for me, one of the biggest areas is just discovery and classification, right? Having that ability to have a good understanding of your data landscape, right? You know, for me is a good part of, you know, if it is a 12-step program, let's kind of focus on that piece first, because I think everything starts to key off of that. You know, the protection and everything else that you want to wrap around it is critical, but you got to understand it first. So I would say it's a good start. Yeah.
Chad?
Yeah, know where your data is and know who consumes it and how they consume it. What are the downstream applications that consume your data that could be potentially then affected by these kinds of notifications. But then also, you know, it's way easier to exactly what Joe was saying, don't get breached, right? So it's way easier to prevent that and start knocking off some of the simplest, you know, password reuse is 80% of the breaches we see. Get multi-factor authentication in there, you've no excuse for it now. It requires a little bit of work, but it is one of the biggest preventers you can do of getting breached. And you don't have to worry as much about disclosing whether or not you got breached if you don't get breached. So like spend some time on that. Right now, it's an easy thing to do. There's loads of companies that support it now, and start down that road.
So I agree with what my colleague said. So I'm not contradicting. So I guess I'm saying just look at this slightly differently. I think the perception is that the regulated industries are kind of perceived as being the most secure. Yeah. That's not what I've seen. Talk to somebody in manufacturing, asset management, someone doing M&A. they are maniacal about security because their intellectual property is their survival. If their competitors get their information, they're out of business. And I think if everybody thought about what it's going to take to survive in this world, security is just it's secondary at that point.
Yep.
So.
Okay.
Yep.
Well, we're at the end of our time. I'm not sure that we actually have time to do any questions from the floor, but I think all of us will be off to the side of the stage. If anybody would like to follow up, I'd like to thank you for taking the time to chat with us. We've just scratched the surface, and we'd welcome opportunity to follow up with everybody thereafter or in the future. So thanks, guys, very much for being here with us.
Thanks.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you.